Welcome back. I am Stacie Kent. I am one of the Harper Schmidt Fellows here at the University of Chicago, and I'm delighted to be chairing the third panel of today. Today's discussion, Education, Democracy, and Social Justice. Our first speaker this afternoon is going to be Bryan Garsten. He is a professor of political science and the humanities and chair of the humanities program at Yale University. He has written about political rhetoric and deliberation, the meaning of representative government, the relationship of politics and religion, and the place of emotions in political life. From 2009 to 2011, Garsten was a fellow at the National Forum on the Future of Liberal Education, and in 2012-2013, he served as chair of a committee overseeing the development of a common curriculum in the liberal arts for Yale and U.S. College in Singapore. He also participates in and serves on the University Advisory Council for the Yale National Initiative to strengthen teaching in the public schools. Welcome, Bryan Garsten. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. Let me add my thanks to Erin and Aviva for what's really quite an impressive conversation that we have going. This panel is on democracy and liberal education, so I wanted to take a few minutes to ask a few questions. They're questions I wouldn't necessarily ask in another forum, but we seem to be friends here of liberal education. And so rather than make the case for it by claiming its unique importance for citizenship, I want to ask some questions about how far we can take that argument. Does liberal education need saving? Some people think it needs saving from turning into training, from being turned into entertaining. Training as vocational skills that we've spoken about, and entertaining as missing somehow the ability to bring students to kinds of literature and history that they wouldn't encounter in popular culture. So if we're to save liberal education from turning into training and entertaining, that means we have to make the case for the opposite of what you're trained for, that is for leisure instead of work. And we have to make the case for culture, historical, literary culture instead of popular entertainment. And those are both aristocratic, or as we say now, elite things to make the case for leisure and culture. So it raises the question, does defending liberal education require us to save it from, amongst other things, democracy, or the democratic anti-elitist impulses that lead to suspicions of leisure and culture? And I want to say, to some extent, yes, to some extent, no, essentially. Now, you might respond immediately by saying, well, the important point here, the moment we're at, as was said last night, is the moment in which we can spread leisure and culture much more broadly than has been possible before, perhaps as Keels mentioned, because of the incredible plenty that we're able to produce. And I favor that position. I favor spreading liberal education in that way, and work hard to do it. But it does raise the question anew of what precisely it is that we're spreading to such a large audience. Because the question of access is not the only question about democracy to raise. There's also the question of whether the activities central to our experience of liberal education are ones that contribute to democratic citizenship. So let me mention just a few ways very quickly in which we might worry that liberal education as we practice it today in the United States, especially at elite institutions, might hurt democratic citizenship. One, we constantly speak the language of self-development to our students. This is a time for them to explore themselves, a key moment in their youth in which to find their own interests. Now, these students participate in plenty of public-spirited enterprises, but we don't ask them to participate in one common enterprise that is fundamentally civic about the nation in the United States. So instead of a common enterprise, we emphasize self-development often. Two, education requires paying. That is, we have to make an investment in education. What kind of investment is it? I think more and more, as I say for my students, my son's college, that this is partly, to be honest, an investment in risk management for our children. Now that means that we expect a return of a reduction in risk about their life chances. Now, if that's the kind of not very well hidden motivation behind investing in college, as middle-class families often do, the risk is that the culture at those institutions is one of risk minimization. Is that necessarily good for citizenship? Citizenship is sometimes about making sacrifices of the self. The investment also comes along with parental involvement of a very serious kind. Along with new communications technologies, this means that parents are much more closely linked to their children's experience during college than they once were, and this, it seems to me, comes along with an effort to make college a more comfortable place, a place more like home, and the danger there is that we raise more docile citizens, less independent and self-reliant. There too, there's a question about exactly how well this liberal education serves democratic citizenship. Another obvious point, often raised, meritocracy is the reigning culture of our elite liberal education institutions. What was called early in the 20th century, as the first glimmers appeared, elitocracy at these institutions. Meritocracy is a form of inequality that we think is justified in some way. So what we communicate to students is that inequality is justified, and as we know, those same inequalities, which appear first in admissions and then in college, reappear in the sorting of people into marriages and into their real estate purchases in neighborhoods. And so there's a danger that one kind of merit translates into other sorts of inequality, along with the assumption that it is merited or deserved. I'd also mention that we produce a global circulating elite, people who are very at home in the capitals, in big cities of many countries of the world, who are comfortable talking with one another, products of elite institutions, but who often find their connections to particular local places, even the cities in which their universities exist, quite weak, in spite of perhaps a weekly trip to a local school or soup kitchen or whatever else they do. Now, is that rejection of localism good for democratic citizenly practice? I'm not sure. We'd have to talk about exactly what that citizenship is. And last, just on this quick list that I assembled, it's not clear that education, as we practice it, does not include more habits of deference than we might want in a democratic group of citizens. I don't think it's the case that universities are known for their very egalitarian practices sociologically. When we look at them, look, we're on this stage. So in spite of the back and forth of debate and dialogue, of course, nevertheless, there is inherent in education, you might say, the inequality, the hierarchy of teacher and student, of known and those who want to know. It's not clear what the relationship is to democratic citizenship. So I just raised these points as fairly obvious, ones that at least should be confronted by us as we talk with one another about the relationship between democratic citizenship and liberal education. And I leave aside all the more common points made about the importance of discussion and critical analysis and so on. Now, you might think one solution to these problems would be to eliminate all of the features of education I just mentioned and thereby make it more compatible with democracy, more fostering of democratic citizenship. I think that would be a mistake, actually, because some of those features of education are part of what makes education distinctive. In fact, liberal education is its own culture, which overlaps in some ways, but differs in some ways from democratic culture. And I'd like to suggest that a distinction made by Bruce Kimball in a wonderful book called Orators and Philosophers, which is on the history of liberal education, the history of the idea of liberal education, is helpful here. The distinction is between the oratorical understanding of liberal education and the philosophical one. So when we speak of liberal education as having the goals of forming good citizens, and also when we speak of it as providing skills that are useful in many domains for the students, we are in fact echoing the oratorical tradition. Those were the claims made not by Socrates, but by Isocrates, by Cicero, by Quintilian, by Gorgias, in fact, in a way. Now, the claims of the philosophical tradition of liberal education emphasize much more freedom of thought, critical thinking, meaning really critical analysis, not taking for granted the norms of one's community, rethinking everything from the ground up as much as possible, toleration, and similar values. So, look, it seems to me each aspect of liberal education has its strengths. The oratorical aspect comes along with a strong link to the community norms and understandings. The philosophical comes along with a strong commitment to critical analysis. Are they easily combinable? The temptation, again, is to go for an easy resolution, to say, yes, we need philosophical oratory, oratorical philosophy, or civic humanism, or Socratic citizenship, or the final year of the French lycée education, on the assumption that it helps citizenship, or the new law in Brazil. But it seems to me there's a danger in the easy combination of these two modes of education. If it's done not carefully, we can produce citizens that are too skeptical, too removed from any particular actual community to make sacrifices for it and devote themselves unthinkingly, uncritically to it at key moments. Of course, one shouldn't do that over more than a few moments at a time. Combining them too easily can produce philosophers unwilling to criticize the most basic presumptions of society, that is, not willing to philosophize or think critically, for instance, about democracy itself, about equality itself. Combination can lead to a democratic attack on apprenticeship hierarchies in universities, and to a philosophical attack on public opinion in democratic society. That is, much as the case with religion in politics, where it's common to argue that too close a combination can corrupt both. We might have a similar situation with liberal education and democracy. It seems to me that liberal democracy and liberal education are complementary to one another under the right conditions. But the culture of liberal democracy is different from the culture of liberal education in important ways. And so the right kind of accommodation between the two involves not just always satisfying the impulse to democratize education or to bring more leisure into democracy, but to preserve the complementarity between these two different modes of existence. Liberal education can keep some of its oratorical aspect, its devotion to producing citizens, to working with the norms of the community. Democracy can agree to some special place for the philosophical, more critical part of liberal education, can refrain from making all of liberal education serve political purposes. There's a kind of pluralism in that solution, where democratic society offers space for even forms of being that are less democratic within a certain limit. So it seems to me that for that reason, both democracy and liberal education are fragile cultures. They both probably always need saving from many influences. But I suppose the main thought I wanted to put on the table is that sometimes democracy and liberal education need saving from one another too.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is going to be Micere Keels. She is an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Human Development and a faculty affiliate with the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture here at the University of Chicago. Her work focuses on the intersection of liberal education, gender, and race. She is interested in particular in questions of inequality and has examined the causes and consequences of the widening gender gap in educational attainment, a gap that is largest among Black and Latina Americans. Shay?
Thank you. So I see myself as telling you guys a little bit about global education, inequality, and an increasingly diverse population of students that you might be trying to reach. And in some ways taking up the question of for whom do you want liberal education to work, and who do you want to include in experiencing and getting a lot out of a liberal education. And so also, in many ways, what I'm doing here is bringing a voice to the room of individuals that really aren't in this room. So stigmatized racial and ethnic minority students, and first-generation students that don't have a family history of being in colleges and universities. And so I'm going to be brief, but just to take you into some of their pragmatic concerns and why those pragmatic concerns matter. And then also to take you a little bit into some of their voices so that you can get it from their perspective and not just my interpretation of their perspectives. And so essentially, like, the general thesis that I want to talk to you guys about is that we don't need to be at the poles of a liberal education in a generalist perspective for which college is a time of broadening and deepening the character of men and women, or at the other pole where it's a careerist position. In college is a time of training for specific occupations, and that is the sole goal. But essentially a more fruitful and meaningful middle ground, which is an integrationist position that puts both of these things together, where we are broadening and deepening critical thought with also a focused eye on the careers that students are going to get when they're done with their, some would say, moratorium, but increasingly not, if you have to work and do lots of other things to pay your way through this education, but during this period of college. And so, which means realizing how important college is for social mobility for some students. And this really, for them, is a time when they're trying to educate themselves up the socioeconomic ladder. And so also understanding that really we're in a space where obtaining a college degree is, for many, the dominant route to privately securing their social welfare in the US. And also understanding that, and I'll give you, because of the work that I do, I can't do it without giving numbers. So later on, I'm going to give some real numbers about what graduation rates are and how to, and then we might talk about that after. But there continue to be really large disparities, even among students. There are large disparities in getting into college, but even among students who all get into college, there are large disparities about who make it out of college with a degree. That means, as we all know and see in our society, there are large inequalities that have not been narrowing over time, but really just growing over time. And that matters for thinking about the future of a liberal education and the need to integrate it with a careerist orientation. So as was mentioned in the previous panel, and as Dr. Goldrick-Rab will talk about much more detail, the costs of college are rising. And so that must be considered in the context of what students are doing and how they are thinking about their time. I'm also have my little clock going, so skip through a couple of things that were also discussed earlier and that may be discussed a little bit later. But the idea that there was this tension of initially public benefits of college and the time here, and so there was public bearing of the costs through who and how college was funded. But we have really shifted to a period where it's an idea of private bearing of the costs of college. And so to think about how these things go together, we are in a time when more than $238 million is spent in terms of federal funding for student aid. So we might think of that as a lot of money that's spent on students. But we're also at a time when enrollment in college is at the highest it's ever been. Why? Because the benefits of college, obtaining a college degree, are the highest it's ever been. So we're in a time when the actual amount that any individual student receives in terms of covering the cost of college, because as we all know, college costs have risen, is the lowest it's ever been. So even the amount spent might be very high. The amount received by students in terms of covering the cost of college is low. And just a couple of numbers on that. It was mentioned earlier that we are at a place where even though the pool of applicants and enrollment has increased, the actual number of students with Pell Grants have decreased at this institution. So thinking about who is able to attend the institution. So the average Pell Grant covered 40% of published tuition and fees at four-year public institutions right now, roughly, and 12% at four-year private institutions. In thinking about the fact that even though there's a lot of money, it doesn't cover a whole lot of the actual costs that students have to pay. And so as funding has shifted away from that, that means students are taking up a lot of loans to make their way through college. And as was mentioned earlier, this means it is very, very risky for many students if they don't come from high wealth families that can fund their way through college. And so that's one piece of the puzzle of the context that students are navigating. The other thing that they're navigating is what we call the college for all rhetoric. So the idea that all students should be going to college. And just to give you a little bit of what that looks like, in 1980, less than half of high school sophomores expected to go to college and get a college degree. And by 2002, more than 3/4 of high school sophomores had that expectation. So where we are today is that almost all kids that are going to be graduating from high school have this expectation that college is something that they should be doing. Something that's even more expensive, and increasingly ever more expensive, is something that they should be doing. So more and more of them are enrolling and are getting into college. And also, to let you know what that's like, even though more first-generation minority and lower income, lower wealth students are enrolling in college, so they have increased the most in terms of enrollment. They have increased the least in terms of the likelihood of graduating. So only 47% of students from the bottom quartile are going to graduate within 6 years, compared to 76% of students from the top quartile. So that means that we are enrolling ever more students that are incurring ever more debt and not graduating with a degree to pay off that debt. And so the reason why this is so important is because bears the question of how much of it is our responsibility to ensure that those who we're letting into our colleges and universities, and we are giving them privilege of paying for an education at our institutions, to doing all of the things that we need to do to ensure that they get through to graduation. And to do this, like I said, I'm going to take you a little bit into the voices of some students. There's a study that I'm doing that's following 500 Black and Latino, about 60% first-generation students that are attending 5 different colleges and universities. And these are students that are ready and prepared and have the educational and intellectual wherewithal to make it through college. So we wanted to ensure that we were looking at students where we can't say the reasons they're not making it through is because they weren't prepared enough. So we can take most of that argument off the table, which then forces us to think about what we're doing as institutions to support these students. And so what I want to just close with is the idea that unless we're assuming that we're educating students that come from either fairly high wealth families or families with a generational history of college in their family. And so they understand what this endeavor is all about and what they will get out of this endeavor, even if it feels uncomfortable and uncertain while they're in the midst of it. Unless we're assuming that those are the students that we're educating, it's actually really important to show them the pathway and the benefits of what they're doing in really tangible ways. And so from this sample of students that I'm looking at, one freshman stated, "It costs quite a bit to attend college, and if I'm not quite sure what I'm going to be doing in my life, college may be doing more harm than help." And from the perspective of another, "The biggest issue with college is that it's so expensive. I currently work 2 jobs, and my biggest fear is that while I'm bending over backwards to pay off my tuition, I won't be as successful as I plan to be in the future." Sometimes I wonder if college is worth it, because even with a degree, nothing is guaranteed. In the current state of the economy, sometimes I feel like maybe I'm just wasting my time, especially when I could instead be learning a useful trade or a skill that a college degree doesn't provide. The point here is that to understand that these are students that are attempting to succeed in college while really uncertain about why they're there and will it ever pay off. That means they have a cognitive load that prevents them from fully engaging in the experience while they're there, which means it increases the likelihood that they're going to drop out, all for reasons that have nothing to do with their abilities to get through and get a lot out of it. But because we are not mapping a pathway for them, we are making it difficult for them to engage in the life of the mind that we all talk about while they're there. And then I'm going to close with one particular case that's quite heartbreaking. And so her name is Darla, which is not her real name. So she had a 3.5 GPA and scored in the 95th percentile of the ACT. But to get to that point, she had attended 3 high schools, moved numerous times. Her family was in poverty. So this is an individual who is really, really resilient. She has all of the markers of resilience that one would need to make it through college. But she only lasted halfway through her 2nd semester in her freshman year. And why is that? So she has everything that she needs to make it through, but didn't even make it through the first year. After dropping out, she got a job in a child care center. And this was an interview done with her at what would have been the start of her sophomore year, at which time she was enrolled in a community college. And she said, "After getting her job, I just saw how deficient I was in knowledge and understanding of so many issues that I was like, dang, I need to go to college. I'm very underdeveloped in critical thinking and different things. I'm undereducated and ignorant about so many things. How can I contextualize the issues of today and try to find solutions if I don't understand why they're there in the first place? So I realized I just need to go to college for the education itself, and in order to make more money to accomplish some of those other goals. I need to have a degree because it's what employers want to see. So those are the reasons why I'm back in school. That's what I thought I had been going to college for in the beginning, but it was more like I was telling myself cliches instead of actually understanding those phrases." And essentially, just to make the point that it was a really costly lesson for her to have to learn these things for herself. The cost being the first year and leaving without a degree, but with substantial student debt that she's now trying to pay off while going to community college, because she no longer has that 4-year institution scholarship. And just the importance of us taking on the responsibility of helping students map their way through so they understand the benefits of this broad intellectual development and why they're doing it.
Great, thank you very much. Our third speaker is going to be Rana, Saadi, Liebert, who is a site director and faculty member of the Bard Prison Initiative, an innovative college-in-prison program sponsored by Bard College. She has taught in the Classics Department at the University of Chicago and in the Classical Studies program, the Language and Thinking program, and the first-year seminar at Bard College. Her research focuses on the relationship between ethics and aesthetics in ancient literature and philosophy, ancient and modern theories of emotion, and the history of conceptualizing fiction.
And thanks once again, Aviva and Aaron, for putting together a very stimulating, eclectic group and allowing me to return to Chicago and kind of relive a more liberal way of life than I have of late. It's been a great visit. Okay, I teach in a college program that offers incarcerated men and women a chance to pursue a degree in the liberal arts from a prestigious academic institution, and that prestige is important to them. Offering an education, befitting the free to the most disenfranchised members of our society can strike some of you as ironic. Many indeed have questioned the value of this education for that population. But to educators like myself who teach in impoverished settings like prison, the value of the liberal arts and of the most beleaguered among them, the humanities, is nowhere more self-evident. So I want to spend the next few minutes asking why this should be. What about the correctional environment and the incarcerated student serves to highlight the specific value of a liberal education, which is otherwise so obscure and difficult, I think, to defend. So as a classicist, plying a very impractical trade in prison, I feel well positioned to answer this question. So I'm going to draw both on my personal experience teaching for the Bard Prison Initiative, I should say on whose behalf I do not claim to speak. This is purely anecdotal, and on my academic experience studying one of the first theorists of liberal education. I want to articulate for myself and others how an education befitting the free has benefited those whose freedom is so severely restricted. So to begin, I want to look at a passage from Aristotle's Politics, which discusses the aim of education. And you have to forgive me, it's a little bit lengthy. So Aristotle says, life as a whole is divided into business, askolia, and leisure, skole, which is, of course, the etymology of school, leisure, and into war and peace. And some of our actions are for things necessary and useful, others for things noble and beautiful. In these matters, the same principle of preference that applies to the parts of soul must also apply to their activities. Wars for the sake of peace, business for the sake of leisure, things necessary and useful for the purpose of things noble and beautiful. Therefore, the statesman must legislate with all of these considerations in view, concerning both the parts of the soul and their activities, aiming more at the superior goods and the ends. And the same principle applies to ways of life and choices of conduct. One should be capable of engaging in business and war, but still more capable of living in peace and being at leisure. And one should do what is necessary and what's useful, but still more should one do what is noble and beautiful. So it is with these aims in view that people should be taught, both while still children and at later ages that require education. And that's the end of the quote. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with talk of soul parts, suffice it to say that Aristotle views the human soul as a system of abilities hierarchically arranged. So for Aristotle, the non-rational faculties like biological drives, sense perception, instrumentally serve the purpose of thinking. They exist to make thinking possible, which Aristotle takes to be the only intrinsically worthwhile activity for human beings because it's the only specifically human activity. It is because of this strong value distinction between instrumental and intrinsic goods that leisure becomes so central to Aristotle's understanding of education and for his understanding of human happiness itself, which he claims exists in leisure. We need leisure to be happy. So leisure, like peace, nobility, beauty, is an end state, right? Not a means to some further end. And the aim of a liberal education should be to teach us what to do when we arrive at this end state. Or else we find ourselves forgetting the point of all our labor and mistaking the means for the goal, and hence denying ourselves the most rewarding kind of life. So it's worth pausing a moment to note just how foreign Aristotle's thinking has become in a world increasingly dominated by or oriented by economic utility and the professions that maximize it. The idea that leisure constitutes the final end of life sounds quaint and genteel, to be sure, but rather naive and impractical, not to mention downright un-American. As a nation crucially informed, to be cliche, by a Protestant ethic of work, we are particularly prone to thinking of usefulness as the only relevant measure of value. And we degrade activities that lack a practical outcome as idle, if not useless. Unlike Aristotle, we tend to divide life into work and play, and our activities into productive and non-productive categories, and in doing so, we make ourselves servile. And we forget, or we never knew, Aristotle's adage that, quote, to seek utility everywhere is entirely unsuited to those who are great-souled and free, end quote. It would serve us well to reintroduce Aristotle's concept of leisure into discussions of education in order to regain sight of ultimate aims and intrinsic goods. What Aristotle has in mind when he speaks of leisure as our aim is not vacation or recreation, activities that serve to restore and rejuvenate our ability to work, right? For that reason, remain instrumental. He's referring rather to high culture, reading, writing, musical appreciation, intellectual debate, philosophical contemplation, mathematical reasoning, the study of the natural world, right? This should all seem familiar. What he has in mind is the continued pursuit in our free time of liberal arts. A liberal education aims to teach us how to occupy our time in a liberal manner, how to make our free time into leisure, so that we may fulfill our human potential and thereby become great-souled and free. Paradoxically, liberal education thrives, in my experience, precisely where men and women are least free in the conventional sense. So I want to try to understand how leisure can arise out of such constrained conditions. To live freely or liberally means for Aristotle three things: to live without external constraints, with the autonomy to direct one's own activity, and with the education to direct it well. It's true that the incarcerated student fails, in a very important sense, to satisfy the first condition. Physical detainment is the very definition of external constraint. But no one is altogether free of constraints. While those of us outside of prison retain our freedom of movement and our civil liberties, we still have to work, feed ourselves, take care of our families, run our households, and manage our lives. The conventional college student is less constrained, certainly, but constantly distracted by some form of recreation or the dizzying array of possible career tracks, all holding out the promise of wealth and worldly success, and in the case of incurring debilitating debt, right, that serves as even greater constraint. So in these arenas, incarcerated students are actually at an advantage. They have free time and very few options at their disposal for occupying it. What to do with the vast, undifferentiated expanse of unoccupied time? How does one survive the tedium of the endlessly repeated mods, they call them? These are 2-hour time blocks that prisons use in attempt to structure this time. Correctional facilities provide industries, vocational programs, religious services, and primary and secondary education, all of which serve a useful and beneficial purpose, to be sure, but these programs offer little or nothing by way of culture. A liberal education is so valuable in this setting because it equips the culturally impoverished student with the means to make the most rewarding, most human, you could say, use of his or her time. When external constraints close off the possibility of pursuing instrumental goods, such as recreation, wealth, political power, right, space opens up for liberal education to thrive. And this is the space that BPI has opened up in New York State prisons across the state. So entering this space, pursuing this degree, is one of the few activities freely chosen by the incarcerated student, who thereby, I think, satisfies Aristotle's second condition of autonomy for a liberal way of life. Crucial to the success of an initiative like BPI is the fact that it is voluntary and that it is selective. It's extremely selective. About 200 students apply. We choose about 15 of that group. This gives the students a great deal of pride in what they undertake, a sense of ownership over their own intellectual development. Because the curriculum is very traditionally liberal, so it offers classes in literature, philosophy, social sciences, fine arts, mathematics, hard sciences, pretty much everything sort of classically understood as liberal arts, and is extremely rigorous, the student is exposed to a wide range of intellectually demanding subjects. And the positive effects of such exposure are pretty much immediately apparent. I mean, the learning curve is very steep. While it is extraordinarily stressful and difficult, the experience of college and prison is experienced by nearly all of my students as a profound intellectual awakening, with consequences that extend far beyond the classroom and beyond the prison. They spend their time in the library or the computer lab rather than the gym or the yard. They acquire interests and passions they didn't have and which they share with their friends and family. And they just articulate themselves and carry themselves very differently. And this transformation is really conspicuous to all. The liberally educated student in prison has reclaimed his or her time and has become in the process a model of a liberal way of life. To be sure, there are instrumental reasons to offer this kind of education in this kind of setting. BPI and other college programs in prison rightfully boast of a remarkable reduction in recidivism. It's the rate at which the incarcerated come back after their release. And this saves taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars in re-imprisonment costs. But while keeping people out of prison and reducing taxes are surely civic gains, these are not the reasons I teach in prison. And I'll venture to say, not the reasons BPI offers a liberal education in prison. The reason is that there is just great human potential in this neglected segment of our society, and that the task of educators and educational institutions is to find and realize that human potential. A liberal education does this better than any other kind because it treats the student as a human being first, with a will to know and understand things, rather than as an economic agent or tool with earning and spending power. In a correctional environment, this treatment is really nothing short of revolutionary. The dominant model of education is vocational, and the prison system itself is structured to dehumanize the inmate. The humanizing effects of the liberal arts are for that reason more conspicuous. On the outside, ironically, we are often so preoccupied by economic concerns and dazzled by economic success that we become complicit in our own dehumanization. Seeing and articulating the success of liberal education in impoverished settings like prison, I think, can reorient our pursuits towards genuinely human goods. Thank you.
Thank you, Rana. Our last speaker on the panel is Sara Goldrick-Rab. She is the Professor of Educational Policy, Studies, and Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She served as the lead author of the Brookings Institution's 2009 report, Transforming America's Community Colleges, whose recommendations were included in President Obama's American Graduation Initiative later that year. In 2014, she co-authored a report that called for a free two-year college option, which the New York Times cited as, quote, a clear influence on the Obama plan for free community college introduced during the 2015 State of the Union address. Goldrick-Rab founded the Wisconsin Harvesting Opportunities for Post-Secondary Education, the HOPE Lab, in May of 2014 to test the efficacy of college affordability programs and received the American Educational Research Association Early Career Award in the same year. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be here, and I should note that Monday is my last day at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. On Tuesday, I begin at Temple University as a professor of higher education policy and sociology, and I will say a few things about that in a couple of minutes to help you understand that, no doubt. And I do want to note that I'm going to throw some numbers in this talk, and I know that you're scholars and you want to look for them. So I have a book coming out this fall called Paying the Price, College costs, financial aid, and the betrayal of the American dream, and I'm happy to say that the University of Chicago is actually publishing that. All the numbers that I'm talking about will be in there. So I'm going to pick up on the last part of the title of this panel, which was actually Liberal Education, Democracy, and Social Justice. And I think that social justice is perhaps the reason that I'm here. And on that line, instead of quoting Aristotle, I'm going to quote the Wu-Tang Clan. And it's going to be very simple. The Wu-Tang Clan has said quite clearly, cash rules everything around me. And that's the story of my scholarly life, is to understand the ways in which the fact that cash rules everything around today's undergraduates, even those at no loans institutions, has changed everything about what it means to be a student in higher education. There is a crisis. The crisis, as we heard on the last panel, is that at this famed and fabulous and well-respected institution, just 12% of the students qualify for the federal Pell Grant, which is our proxy for low-income students. While across town, at an institution that frankly I'm more accustomed to visiting, Chicago State, it's 71%. While over at Olive Harvey, one of the city colleges of Chicago, where I cut my teeth in terms of scholarly work, it's 44%. Why is it lower there? Because there are so many students there who can't file that piece of paper for all kinds of reasons, including that they're undocumented. Now, you would probably assume that this institution, with all of its wealth, with all of its fabulous professors who can teach so many things, would offer low-income students a very low price. So it really must be a puzzle then that so few students are here from those families. But according to federal data for the year 2013-2014, the out-of-pocket price after all financial grants and scholarships provided to students from families earning less than $30,000 a year at the University of Chicago was almost $9,000. That's after all grants. You might also assume that that price would be significantly lower than across town at Chicago State, since this institution has an endowment magnitudes larger. But it's not. Chicago State's after grants and scholarships price is $10,000 a year. You might further assume that by coming to this institution or to that one, they would be charged more money, significantly more money than if they'd gone to a community college, so perhaps they ought to sort that direction. But Olive Harvey's out-of-pocket price is over $7,000. All three of those prices exceed federal loan limits. What we're saying is that even for a family earning less than $30,000 a year to send their child to college is to come up with more money beyond what they can even borrow from the federal government. And the rates for those federal loans, as we all know, are not what they used to be. So the crisis, frankly, is the difficulty that we face in allowing our students to learn among students from different family backgrounds and to provide them the time and space and energy that they need to focus on school. Now, the numbers that I just quoted you are, according to federal definition, what we call the cost of attendance. They are not tuition and fees. Yes, they include living costs. They include books and supplies, and the reason is quite clear. As you all know, try to learn philosophy while worrying about whether you have a roof over your head or enough food to eat, or without the required texts. These days, one of the challenges that our educators at our far less elite institutions are facing is that students can't cover what the financial aid office refers to as personal expenses. We might think that those personal expenses are things like our cell phones or our purses. I interview financial aid officers frequently, and I listen to them talk about their confusion when a student comes in and asks for a loan, but they see their nice bag. They don't know that they got it at a thrift store. They don't know that their phone is a third or whatever generation. I don't even know my terms there. What they don't realize is that we have students today who are not able to put on the proper clothing to show up in our institutions. That I recently interviewed a provost in Miami who told me that her challenge of the morning was that she had a faculty member call who said that she could no longer have a student in her classroom because he smelled too much. He was not bathed. She was trying to figure out how to tell the gentleman that she needed to remove his clothing to go wash it for him so that he could come to class the next day. The consequences of that for the kinds of deep work that we're talking about people having the time and space to do are enormous. The high price of attendance, I believe, is one of the reasons why higher education today undoubtedly exacerbates inequality at least as much as it ameliorates it. It is a key driver to not only the stratification of where people attend college and what they major in, but their own experiences within the campus. The segregation of students, not just by classroom, but by social experiences, the fact that they can no longer even afford to eat together because residence halls contain cafeterias that have particular price points associated with them, such that students live in one place or another based on their family resources and their aid package. I think that does real harm to the notion that they'll discuss great books together and learn among one another. I don't think we even have to go as far, frankly, as to go into prison to find the oppression. One of my recent studies of 10 community colleges nationwide, we surveyed over 4,000 students, and we learned that 1 in 5 of them qualified as the very lowest levels of food security. In other words, they're hungry. I'm not talking ramen. I'm not talking about they don't have the food they want. I'm talking they don't have food on a regular basis. 13% of those students were homeless. I've done the same sorts of studies at the four-year colleges and universities, the public sector in Wisconsin. We're finding the same sorts of numbers. We don't ask these things. We don't measure these things. Nowhere on our campuses do we typically measure material hardship, nor do we ask the question, are there even genuine opportunities to learn? Are they sleeping through our classes because we bore them? Or are they sleeping through our classes because they work the third shift to stock the shelves at the grocery store the night before? I think that too often, the students who have the resources get a pass, frankly, for their sleeping. They can afford their books, they might use them as pillows, but mom and dad won't revoke their resources if at the end of the semester they don't get a passing grade. If at the end of one of your classes, a student receiving the federal Pell Grant does not get satisfactory academic progress standards, which include not only the grades in your class, but the number of courses they attempted and completed in the semester, then they will have no access to any federal aid any further. It includes their loans. It's all revoked. So what's on the horizon as we try to fight for the future of liberal education? Well, unfortunately, even the sorts of policies that I and others have pursued to try to make college more affordable, which I think in many cases are laudable in intent, if not carefully crafted and carefully implemented, will have downstream effects, changing the curriculum, the opportunities and ideas that students will actually experience in higher education. And I think that access to a rigorous liberal education is at the most at risk. Consider some of the most popular strategies for lowering the price, many of which my governor in Wisconsin has undertaken. First, very popular one, freezing tuition, backed many times by the students. I didn't know how to deal with the fact that they wanted to freeze tuition, so I decided to introduce a class for undergraduates on higher education policy, where I take the entire semester to try to explain to them why this is a challenge. What it tends to do is actually drive up the cost of attending college because it curtails access to the very courses that students need by cutting back on the faculty and staff. So students we're seeing nationwide are taking far more than 4 years for a 4-year degree, taking far more than 2 years for a so-called 2-year degree. And one of the reasons is that those institutions that those students attend are the most likely to already be under-resourced. Reason being that while we have conversations in K-12 education about adequacy and equity of funding, we don't have those conversations in higher ed. If we did, institutions like mine at UW-Madison might be sued because we receive $16,000 per undergraduate student, enrolling just 12% Pell, just like the University of Chicago, while across the state, the University of Milwaukee, which is over 30% Pell, receives just 5%. The most disadvantaged students, the most resources going in the opposite direction. Another approach undertaken by the governor of Texas, shortening time to degree. So the idea being that we will just simply curtail students' costs by making them move through the program faster. Some of these things make some sense. For example, introducing winterim terms, shorter periods of time in which students can take one course at a time rather than having a heavier load at other periods of the time. I think we can even consider summer coursework. Year-round schooling seems to have some benefits for some students. The problem being, of course, that they have to work, we say, during the summer, but that has everything to do with price. Limiting their choices is the latest thing on the horizon for making college more affordable. We've been told that the biggest problem we have with our nation's community colleges is they offer students too many choices. That what we need to do is implement guided pathways because they can't cognitively, partly because of their scarcity, undertake the complexity to choose their courses. What worries me deeply about this is we are headed towards a system in which the wealthy have choices in college, the poor do not, even more so than now, and they will graduate unable, frankly, to process these things. It's an interesting thing, we were talking about it over lunch actually, because I think that what is missing perhaps from the community college, as it is from many institutions, is the sense of a core curriculum. I think these students would benefit from a core, but I don't think they needed to be simply just guided throughout college as is being discussed. Proposals to make college free, and particularly to make all of public higher education free, by bringing state appropriations back up and appropriately focusing expenditures on educational activities, I think that could serve to protect liberal education if properly implemented. And I think that the scariest part of the way that these things have been talked about, because they have not been rolled out as planned by us scholars, is that they are cast, in a sense, as fast, cheap, and out of control. When what they are intended to do is to revitalize the discussion about the purposes and the shape of public higher education, and they are intended to direct more resources into educational activities. They are actually intended, for example, to shift the pendulum back from a move towards contingent faculty towards full-time professors. And the implementation of that sort of thing is critical and is the least likely to be implemented, for example, in states like Tennessee that are running the fastest. Now, consider, if you have to get real concrete about this, the latest changes to public higher education in Wisconsin. If you follow the news, you'll see time and again that the changes we have seen implemented by Governor Scott Walker, which were referred to last night by Martha Nussbaum, were done actually in the name of college affordability. He has told the families of Wisconsin that the true problem facing them and their pocketbooks is the faculty. We are the enemy. Because we believe that the Wisconsin idea extends to things like liberal education. That in order to have an impact on all corners of our state and indeed the nation, we ought to be pursuing critical thinking. He first attempted to rewrite the Wisconsin idea. He went directly for it, just to undertake a line item change there. And that was rebuffed. So instead, he's taken another approach, which is to go directly for the faculty to get to control over the curriculum. You first have to get to control over who teaches. So in order to reshape programs and departments, you have to reshape who teaches in programs and departments, and thus we now have what I have called fake tenure. We have tenure, he'll tell you. We have great tenure. It's the faculty who are upset and misunderstand things, but what we have is out of line with AAUP standards. And we have it, he believes, because families can no longer afford the price of higher education in Wisconsin. The problem with that is that, of course, there is no link between faculty salaries and rising tuition in the state. There is absolutely no link. In fact, our salaries have been stagnant while the tuition has risen over time. We've been furloughed. We've actually had cuts and we've moved backward. But it is an obvious target. And I want to note that throughout the last couple of days, when I hear the words liberal education, I keep thinking that perhaps the biggest problem we have here is the term. Because this is exactly what my governor thinks. That we are indoctrinating the young people of Wisconsin, teaching them to vote against him. Maybe we are. Maybe we aren't. I have some very conservative colleagues who also teach liberal education, but he doesn't know that, and he doesn't spend any time inside our institutions. I think that these things done in the name of affordability are the most dangerous. And the fight is honestly going to have to go to those students. I actually think that the current students are perhaps the least appropriate target. The students who most need to hear from us are the future students. They're the students who won't hit our campuses for 15 or 20 years, and it's them and their parents whom our messages need to reach. And that's a very different strategy than higher education has ever undertook, but I think it's absolutely necessary. Thank you.
You're a tough act to follow. No, because seriously, I had put together a set of thoughts to try and bring together some of the themes of social justice running through this panel that would also try and connect it to some of the issues that were raised in yesterday's panels and the panels earlier this morning. But those comments do absolutely no justice to the very material problems of educational experience that you just raised, which I think demand our consideration. So if anybody has questions along those lines, I would like to open it up to those questions before I direct the conversation to a more abstract level of conversation about what it means to do liberal arts education under capitalism, which is what my remarks were going to be about, the line of questioning that I was going to open up. But it is at a more abstract and less materially significant level. So if anybody has questions along the lines that Sarah's opened up, I think we should start there.
So I'm from Illinois, but I'm not from Hyde Park these days. So it was nice to hear the recognition of the fact that this particular state is in a huge higher education crisis that is destroying lives all over the state, and both the lives of employees, faculty, staff, and it's affecting public and private higher education in terrible ways. So I was curious about everyone. It seems to me there's three issues going on here. One's the broadest definition of democracy. But then there's also something going on here about the relationship between the prison industrial complex, various socioeconomic or other identity categories, and policy at the federal and state level. So I just wondered if all four of you have any policy-related recommendations at the federal or, please God, help us in Illinois.
I don't approach this from a policy perspective just because I'm an academic, right, who found myself teaching in a sort of the prison industrial complex. So I think you're more qualified to take this one than I am.
I mean, Illinois is in an impossible situation, and it's not alone, right? It's the one state that I wasn't interested in moving to. Hate to say it. And I have to admit that I think that the federal government is going to have a very hard time getting its. I think there are folks there who know that it has to get some grasp on the states. I think we have pretended for a very long time that higher education was a partnership between the feds and the states. I don't think the partnership ever really existed. I think that somebody said there's a partnership and set up a funding formula that reflected a partnership, and it eroded just very quickly. I mean, the numbers that were quoted on the Pell Grant, when I looked back at, to the inception of the Pell Grant and tried to understand why the purchasing power of the Pell had fallen so fast, I actually went state by state to see which states actually, when the federal government increased its resources, which states increased their resources, and for how long did they do so? Very, very few, frankly, ever matched the federal contribution, and then they just went off very quickly. So I think one of the biggest problems facing higher education, frankly, is the persistent and long-term lack of consensus about its importance, particularly in public higher education. I think that it still continues to be a very contentious topic as to whether it is a right or a privilege, and I think that has to be resolved. And I think that clearly there are other priorities that we have not moved away from. I mean, it's very clear, for example, that when we're told that higher education funding does not exist, that we're told that the cost of the prisons is where it's at. I know one of the most recent policy proposals out there, I don't know if the president's fully rolled this out yet, but in an effort to bring education to the prisons, the federal prison system is going to have a school system nationwide. I mean, I guess that's one way to go at it. Another would be to get people out of there.
To that effect, I know BPI has launched, BARD is launching not just a prison initiative, which is already sort of successful, but it's doing something called micro colleges now, where it's going into social service areas and programs and offering college to sort of underserved people that way. So it's piloted a program like this in Holyoke, Massachusetts, at a place called the Care Center that serves single mothers, and so they're offering them a chance to pursue a liberal arts degree. Now, I don't have any policy proposals, but it's worth noting that the cost of offering this education to a student in prison is about $5,000 for us. So I mean, it's possible to give a very good education, to offer a very serious, rigorous education for very little money. So I feel like people need to start thinking more creatively about how to do that.
So I will sort of intervene then at this moment to kind of open up from this more practical policy question to the larger question of context, because what struck me when I was reading through the papers is that really we're dealing with kind of three practical, concrete issues of social justice, right? One is this issue of college affordability and college debt. The other is the question of, do we create structures in which all students can succeed, right? And then that seems to have some tight connection to this issue of money, right? But then the other also seems to be that the fact that those who struggle to obtain access to college and to persist in college also come from the communities that have been historically discriminated against and socioeconomically as well as politically disenfranchised, right? So in some ways, the university is sort of an expression of larger socioeconomic and political problems, right? It's a symptom, not the cause, perhaps. And when I was thinking about those concrete problems, you know, it occurs to me that we're facing two questions here, really, right? To sort of to riff off of what's been said about living a good life and Aristotle, right? I mean, it's, you know, what is it to live a full and best human existence, right? Because if that's not the aim of social justice, I don't know what is, right? It seems to me that that's the ultimate aim, is that every individual be able to live a full human existence. But then there's also the question of the specific conditions that have to be reformed and overcome in order to attain that full and best lived existence. And this is really where sort of thinking about capitalism, it seems to me, is imperative. Because on one hand, capitalism requires us to work, right? And all of you have talked about that in some way. And many therefore rightly ask the university to be complicit in this. A college degree is the best ticket to a secure and increasing income. But then securing social justice through the university education produces problems, the kinds of problems that you've all been describing. But this is given the present organization of education, work, and life. And in particular, I'm thinking here about the fact that participating in the workforce comes at a cost. You have to pay to play, right? And paying to play generates risks. It exacerbates already existing social, economic, and political inequalities. But it's also the paying to play that seems to me is raising the questions about the value of the liberal arts education. And so on one hand, as a society, we demand that the university enable a life of work. But then some of us, and this has been part of the conversation going on, is also recognize that this limits the kind of life that people can lead. And so we face the question, I think, of how in the present environment you can make the case that the university do something other than this. Now, I recognize that you're asking a slightly different question, which is how can the university do that first project of getting everyone to work better? But if we are in the context of talking about the liberal arts, it does seem that we are asking the question of what else can college be other than training, right? Which Bryan sort of brought up as sort of one of the versions that were being given, is that's what it should do. And it seems to me that the conditions of possibility for the university to do something other than enable a life of work are conditions in which members of society can feel entitled to achieve the time and energy available for leisure. And here I'm sort of riffing off of Rana's concept of the Aristotelian concept of leisure that Rana brought into the discussion. And this, ironically, of course, this time and energy for leisure, ironically, seems to be afforded only to those for whom the life of work has been taken away, right? So yesterday we heard about Keynes and his vision for the 15-hour work week. But also in the 1950s, Herbert Marcuse, just as sort of one of the texts I teach in liberal arts here, could envision a world in which society was liberated from life as work, right? It appeared irrational in the face of technological development and the material advance of civilization. And I think it should also appear to us irrational today when we live in a world where so much wealth is accumulated in the hands of so few, right? Whereas we have students who don't have the clothes, don't have the food necessary to be able to concentrate on their education. So we remain caught in a world of life as work, and our students today feel the pressures of performance, competition, and insecurity in ways that many of us in the room, I think, did not. And so liberal arts education in its ideal form is sort of positing us out of this world that we live in, this world of life as work and life as instrumental reason. But we haven't achieved the world that it actually is sort of wanting to point us towards, which is a world of leisure and meaning. And so I guess what I want to sort of say is that it seems to me that the issues of college affordability and college as the norm are structured by capitalist wage structures and the increasing diminution of employment. Living wages would take the pressure off college as the route of economic advancement. Less competition for jobs would remove some of the pressures towards instrumentality that devalue the liberal arts. And these aren't policy changes, they're structural economic changes. But they would create the conditions of possibility for the liberal arts to make sense again to the many who question them today. So it seems to me that part of what we're dealing with here is a question of time. Who has it and who doesn't? And I'm wondering, how thinking about time would fit into the critiques that all of you were developing. On one hand, it would seem that the time might enable the kind of reflection that would allow people to want to take risks, right? The kinds of risks that might be necessary to invigorate democratic society. It also seems that time is what a lot of the students who are struggling lack the most, right? And so these are just some of the thoughts, and I think that that if we can kind of step back from the concrete policy issues and think about how have we arrived at the particular problem that we're at, then we can, it becomes a little bit more abstract, I realize, but it might create a broader conversation about the problem that the liberal arts are facing right now.
So I've often wondered what would happen. So we often see the survey data about why college students are in college, and we're seeing the growing number of them that say that, they have to make money and they need a job. But it's rarely disaggregated. And I have to admit that I've done a lot of interviewing of very low-income undergraduates, and what they talk about, actually, about what they love about college and why they want to spend more time there, and they're doing so many things in order to be able to spend time there that, frankly, most of us have never had to do, they find it a huge relief to be in a classroom and to get to listen to ideas and to hear people exchange. I mean, I have had, and especially been very focused on young men recently. Men drop out of college at very high rates. And I have been so surprised to hear them say things like, it's one of the few places where the project for them is becoming whole. They need more time to do it. And the classroom is one of the few places where it is actually happening. It troubles them. They learn things. One young man said the other day that, so he has, his version of housing insecurity is this. When he wakes up in the morning, he hopes that his dad's feet don't hit him when he gets out of bed because he sleeps right next to his father's bed where he's been sleeping for 6 years in an apartment with 12 people. And he said that it was only in college, only in a class where another student had said something about back problems and how having back problems is actually like kind of an elite thing. He didn't know that one could develop them, and now he's worried because of his college class that he might have a back problem. But he had a chance to hear things that he's just never had. And his biggest worry is that he doesn't have the space to do it. He doesn't have the time afforded to do it. But I think it's an interesting thing to think about whether the problem is that they have to earn money on the way out. I don't think even under different structures, that's I guess what I'm saying. I don't think under different structures they're going to want it less. I don't think demand, for example, for college is necessarily only coming from the economic. I think demand for college is coming because we are encouraging people to want to be able to think. And they always have wanted to. I mean, there's always been people who couldn't afford to do things, and we always, the Jews, we hid our books, right? So I think that that's always been there. but I do agree that the structures that we're talking about are greatly inhibiting them from the chance to do so.
Kind of associated with all of the things that are being discussed is the idea that, yes, kids from first generation and minority kids that don't see themselves reflected in the institutions, in many ways want to be here more than the kids who do see themselves reflected in institutions, because they have to do so much more work to be here. It's like, in spite of everything, in spite of all of these things, they are still willing to be in these institutions. So it's not an issue of desire. And the kids that I'm talking about that are very uncertain, in many ways, they want to be here more than the kids who are certain, because they are investing, they are taking on serious loans. And they're taking on a serious risk without any proof that this risk is going to pay off. So they want to be here, but they're not given enough to support their ability to be here. And so that's why I say it's whose responsibility is it? And like taking the responsibility that it's our job as educators to recognize, one, that they do want to be here, maybe even more so than students who have a family history and legacy of being in these institutions. And so then if they're not succeeding, there's some mismatch in the information that they're being given in terms, and they want this intellectual life, but they just need to see how it connects, because for them there is this reality that I have to pay this back. So if you could just assure me of that, then I can relax and focus on this. And so it's not necessarily changing what you do in a liberal education or the humanities side of things. It's just assuring them that there is a pathway, and the humanities and all of those things is part of that pathway.
Can I ask you, what is it they want? Do they want, like, just from your surveys, do they want, economic power, like accreditation? Do they want intellectual pleasure? Or do they want cultural capital? Like, what are they looking for? They want all of the above,
all
maybe?
of the above. So it's
Right.
essentially the idea that there is this thing that our society says that you come to college and get. So I call it, that we've made this thing called college almost seem like a stage in development. That this is a stage that you need to pass through to fully develop into an adult. And that there is all of this learning that's going to happen here, and they want in on that learning. Right. It's just that this learning now costs a lot. So I need to be able to pay it off.
Do they study? What do they study? So what do they tend to major in when they're there?
Oh, so this is across the board in terms of students. I'm talking about students that are in what we consider more traditional liberal arts areas, to all of those that are in engineering programs, but they still aren't sure that there's going to be a payoff in the end, because nothing in their previous experiences have allowed them to be certain that so for most of us, we are certain that an education pays off because we've seen it happen in our communities and others that we know. They are just banking on the idea that I've been told that this education will pay off. And in some ways, when they come into particular institutions, we kind of say, but we can't talk about that here. We don't talk about that here. And so all of a sudden, they're like, well, wait, maybe it doesn't. Because they don't talk about that here, And so it's just assuring them that while you're doing this, living this life of the mind, at the end, don't worry. You're
So you're advocating articulating more clearly the instrumental value.
Yes.
Of what we primarily value for its own sake.
Yes.
But saying it is also going
It
to
is
lead
also.
to jobs and, right.
So invest in this, live in it, enjoy it, without the worry